Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Tuesday, June the 17th. Donald Trump has unexpectedly left the G7 summit in the Canadian Rocky Mountains early, hours after warning Iranians to evacuate Tehran. The US president has just posted to say his return is not connected to events in the Middle East, unlike the suggestions of some in the administration, but the world nevertheless is holding its breath to see what happens next. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico, and we're bringing you the podcast about everything you need to know in British politics in 20 minutes. And in the last few hours, leaders of the world's richest countries, including Britain, have put their name to a communiqué affirming Israel's right to defend itself. Notably, it does not call for de-escalation, as some leaders had wanted when they arrived. We're now in the fifth day of conflict between Israel and Iran. Is it about to get markedly worse?
Donald Trump's final act before leaving Canada was to sign an executive order that finalises that trade agreement with the UK, which will be a massive relief for Keir Starmer. For those of you who had thought the president had already agreed the deal in the Oval Office last month to dramatic fanfare, well, that was only an outline. And once it was done, it had faded into the background, leaving officials and ministers and businesses scrambling to work out when it would be implemented and actually precisely what. But now we have clarity.
Well, kind of. The UK-US agreement will be implemented at the end of the month, we're told. Donald Trump telling reporters in Canada the UK is very well protected because I like them. That's why. Good to know. What was signed overnight was nearly the same as agreed in the Oval Office just over a month ago. But there are some differences, aren't there, Sam?
That's right. It's very good for some industries and less good for others. The centrepiece of the deal will help the beleaguered UK car sector. So it'll slash tariffs on UK car exports from 27.5% to 10%, and cars are the biggest UK export to the US, worth about £9 billion a year. If you remember, there were some firms like Jaguar Land Rover that were saying that they'd make job cuts if tariffs stayed at the higher rate. Now, it's not an open-ended deal. The deal is capped at 100,000 cars a year, similar to existing levels. It's a quota after which tariffs go up, but nevertheless, that will be seen as a win for that sector. There's a sort of surprise win. UK's civil aerospace aircraft sector is actually now even exempt from Donald Trump's baseline 10% tariffs that every country is facing on everything. So that's a significant bit of relief for a sector that's so intertwined with the US industry. I think it would be quite a big boon for that side of the Atlantic as well.
But let's note that the agreement that was signed last night doesn't eliminate US tariffs on UK steel. It leaves them at 25% instead of zero as initially agreed. Talks are set to continue in search of an agreement to take that downwards, in the words of British officials. But it is clearly a blow to a struggling industry. The immediate win for the UK is it gets some certainty here, as you've just reflected, and some relief there on tariffs. But Playbook, talking to a former government trade advisor, Ali Renison, saying, look, respite from US steel tariffs still seems to be at a future unspecified time of Washington's choosing. That wasn't quite what we were messaged the last time we got the good news from the UK government on trade.
No, that's right. And also, of course, the UK has taken a stake in the British steel industry, so it's even more problematic. That, as far as we can tell, the hitch over steel seems to be US concern about ownership. One of the documents actually says the nature of ownership of the relevant steel plants is one of the things that still needs to be sorted out. Now, although UK government has taken day-to-day control of British Steel, which runs Britain's last remaining blast furnaces, the legal owner remains the Chinese Jingye Group. And so that is seen as one of the sort of issues. The other is connected to Tata, which is actually Britain's biggest steel manufacturer. Now, a lot of their steel does go to the US. But the particular problem there is that we're in the middle of a transition from blast furnaces to these greener electric arc furnaces at Port Talbot. But as that goes along, Tata has been importing steel from plants in India and Europe for finishing in Britain. And under trade rules, particularly under US trade rules, what matters is where steel products are melted and poured. And that is not in Britain. And therefore, how is the trade agreement going to treat products like that? Possibly not as generously. And that could be problematic for Port Talbot.
But never mind the many wrinkles here, I think this will be seen as still a win for Keir Starmer, a vindication of his more softly diplomatic approach, refusing to overtly criticise Trump, and he's sticking to that, being very diplomatic on this trip to the G7 or G6. But really the only story that is dominating is the crisis over Iran and Israel and the escalation of that conflict. Israel being really clear that not only does it want to disenable the nuclear program in Iran, but it is moving step by step and target by target to take out as many of the Iranian leadership as it can. Now, formally, Sam, the British position is pro de-escalation, isn't it? It was the first thing that Keir Starmer said. He's in a slightly difficult position with Israel, not flavour of the month after slapping sanctions on a couple of far-right ministers there in the coalition in Israel. But it doesn't look like these words are being heeded. And the fact that Donald Trump went back to Washington, that could just be Donald Trump doing a Donald Trump. But it also did have the feeling that possibly America may be about to take a more muscular role in the conflict and more directly. We don't know that, but that is, I think, what really sort of roused everyone in Canada and made them perhaps realise that this was moving even faster than we thought.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the words that Keir Starmer has signed up to and Donald Trump has signed up to in that closing communique, the joint statement between the different G7 leaders. It says, we have been consistently clear that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. So that part of the communique does seem to lean into the G7 leaders, at least, seeing Iran as more of an aggressor, more of the trigger for what's happened rather than Israel. It also says we urge the resolution of the Iranian crisis and hoping for a broader de-escalation of hostilities in the Middle East, including a ceasefire in Gaza. And there are also concerns over the global energy markets and the stability of those, which feels like a sort of slightly hedged set of neuroses and worries from world leaders. But there is a bit of back and forth over the nature of whether or not the US is going to side with Israel and take some kind of role. Donald Trump's press secretary initially suggesting that he was leaving because of the Middle East, but now the president posting on Truth Social in the last couple of hours suggesting that he wasn't.
And it also depends whether Iran goes for US targets in the Gulf, as it's threatened to do in retaliation. We know that there is an emergency National Security Committee meeting happening today in Washington, and that is the formal reason why Donald Trump has left the G7 or the G6, take your pick, early. But we don't know really whether there will be a different approach to de-escalation from the Europeans than there will be in Washington. I just point that out because I think that's basically what's been happening over Russia-Ukraine in the last weeks, and the fairly sort of non-committal statement there of any intent to really do much about that from Donald Trump. Sometimes they simply mean different things even if they sign the communique.
That's right. We'll find out a little bit more from Keir Starmer when he returns on Wednesday. One of the notable things about Keir Starmer's trip abroad is how, in all his own communications, or most of his own communications, because he films little videos of himself when he's abroad, he's at pains to stress how he's working when he's abroad for the people back home. So I think we should actually sort of take this podcast back to the UK and see how it's looking from a domestic, and politics is looking from a domestic perspective. It's Tuesday, so it's our weekly YouGov Sky Times voting intention poll. Reform UK, well, it hasn't breached the 30% mark. It's actually down 2 points on 27. Labour on 24, up 1, Conservatives on 17, Lib Dems on 15, and Greens on 10. One thing actually leaps out at me in the voting intention poll. We've had 8 days for the announcement about the winter fuel U-turn to rattle around and people to notice that. Last week was a bit too soon for it to be picked up in the polls. Last week, 14% of over 65s said that they would vote Labour. This week, 14% of over 65 say that they will vote Labour. So I presume that Downing Street is just going to have to accept that either people have noticed and not changed their mind, or will notice when the payments actually start in the autumn. But certainly the announcement itself, done in the flurry in the run-up to the spending review, doesn't seem to have moved the markets amongst older potential Labour voters.
Interesting, that. And on the other side of the aisle, Kemi Badenoch has a press conference today. Presumably, she will try to seize the initiative there on grooming gangs after that excoriating report from Louise Casey yesterday. And there's a Home Affairs Committee which will also be talking to Louise Casey this morning. That's bound to create some news. So she's not holding back at all, as she also, in her comments to Sky News, that do-gooders, quite pejorative language there, as well as strong language, she was saying, tried to bury the sickening evidence of Asian grooming and rape gangs for fear of giving racists ammunition, only for that to happen. Anyway, one thing I'm really curious about, Sam, and I don't know if you know a bit more about this, is what happens now to Casey herself? I mean, she really has put herself so strongly out there. She's been very direct that she changed her own mind about the need for a national inquiry after she'd started to sift through the evidence and scale of this. But what form will that take? Obviously, she can't do it. She's got other things to do. She's leading social care report. She is the go-to for reports of things that have gone badly wrong, really, in large parts of Britain. But, there are a lot of sceptics, including the prosecutor Nazir Afzal, who I know well, who's very outspoken himself, who says, look, what is it going to be? Because if it goes into the kind of detail that Casey is saying was missed, it would be wildly expensive and time-consuming.
The purpose, as far as I can tell, of Louise Casey's decision to recommend a national inquiry is actually to try and get people who are involved and hold them accountable for the decisions that have been made, particularly over the last 15 years. If you read the specifics of the recommendation for a national inquiry, it is clear that it is all about identifying participants who either didn't push for prosecution or sidestepped the sort of difficulties around this area, calling them as witness, barring them from destroying evidence, compelling them to produce papers. One of the things that just comes through the 200-page report from Louise Casey is her anger that this has been such a discussed topic and yet so little has been done. She goes through the timeline that stretches all the way back to 2009 of the various prosecutions, the various local level reports and the serious case reviews, the various national reports that have been done, like the one by Alexis J, the newspaper stories, the documentaries, the dramas. And yet, even now, she points out, data around, for instance, ethnicity is not properly recorded. And she highlights that one of the most interesting bits to me was she talks about those serious case reviews, which are local level inquiries into stuff that's gone wrong. And she says, in that, more often than not, the official reports, the serious case reports, do not discuss the perpetrators, let alone their ethnicity or any cultural drivers. There is a palpable discomfort in any discussion of ethnicity in most of them. I think she wants to see the national inquiry empowering individual local inquiries to be able to hold people to account and account for their past decisions. And that is the point of it, because she's done the conclusions, right? She has pointed the finger. She's made clear she thinks she knows the ethnicity, and that she knows the problem of discussion. But this is a report that does not seek to blame individuals. I think she thinks that bits of the state need to be made to answer for their decisions.
I'm going to quote a bit of Bertolt Brecht before we move on, which is injustice has a name and an address. And I think that is, it's really what, in this long and very thorough report, actually very impressive report, I think that is really what Louise Casey, she's pointing the inquiry to say, go and find those institutions, go and find out who made those decisions to sidestep this. Go into their motivations and flush it all out in public. It would be fascinating how the politics of that play out.
The only wrinkle with everything is that the National Inquiry does seem to look like it wants to empower local investigations. But there is a question of what Whitehall was doing. Yesterday, my Sky colleague Liz Bates published part of an interview with Dominic Cummings, where he pointed out that in 2011, Department for Education officials were recommending to the Secretary of State, Michael Gove, to sort of assist Rotherham Council's court case to try and stop the Times publishing details of grooming gangs. In other words, Whitehall officials appear complicit in an attempt to cover up the grooming gang scandal. It's not entirely clear to me that that will be flushed out in the report and the national inquiry to come, which largely focuses, it would seem, on different local areas.
One story, I think, which would have made more headlines were it not for a fair amount of competition for news desks at the moment, Sam, is a proposed law change aimed at fully decriminalising abortion. And that will be debated in the Commons today. Two Labour MPs, Tonia Antoniazzi and Stella Creasy, have tabled rival amendments to the Crime and Policing Bill, under which this falls, so that the Speaker could pick one or indeed both amendments to be debated by MPs, and then just one likely to go to a vote. Now, MPs, as we know, usually given a free vote on abortion, meaning they don't have to follow the party line. But what is interesting here is that it's an amendment which aims to prevent women from being investigated, arrested, and then potentially prosecuted or even imprisoned for terminating their own pregnancies. And that's the sort of the context that we really haven't revisited abortion access, and particularly as the means of securing abortions now often through medication that you can take at home. We haven't really had much Commons activity discussing this and whether how far we go towards the view that it's a fundamental human right or that there are still limits. Of course, there is still that 24-week limit is not being questioned here, but it's what happens about the means within that time, which is a really fascinating story. And I know Sky's done a lot on it.
So I think that the Commons Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, will pick one of the two different amendments, either Tonia Antoniazzi's or Stella Creasy's. I would imagine it would be Tonia's because Stella's goes further and doesn't necessarily have the backing of government, even if it is passed, to enshrine this as a human right. It's interesting that Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, has intervened in this. It's a matter of conscience, but we know from the Times the letter that she's written to her constituents, basically saying that some of these proposals are dangerous. So it isn't clear whether or not this is and how this is going to play out. And there are those who worry that if you change the essential kind of compromise that Britain has got to, then you risk jeopardizing some of the rights that have been fought for and won over years. Just some polling for you from YouGov for Sky. 6% of people in the UK think it's too easy to get an abortion, 9% too difficult, 56% think it's about right. But on the principle of decriminalisation, 55% of people support that. 25% think abortion rules should continue to be enforced by criminal law. So you get a sense of public opinion, but we'll find out later today where MPs lie.
That's pretty finely balanced. I'm guessing that the government hopes this is dealt with in the debate today, and conclusion is reached. I think what they don't want is abortion to continue and end up becoming a sort of part of a conflagration in the culture wars, which it clearly has the potential to do. I think we're nearly out of time, Sam, if I'm reading your clock correctly.
That's right. So a busy day at home and abroad, and we will bring you everything that happens tomorrow when we reconvene on Wednesday morning.
Back to it the Wednesday. See you then.